decision. The content, which generally lacks legal basis and specifics on violated laws, shocked me, the world, and the Brazilian people. This secrecy occurs because Brazil has no law criminalizing fake news, whatever that is. For these reasons, Moraes currently faces 100 complaints in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Regrettably, they have been sitting on these cases. The United States may have a broad role in this sad story as well. Some could even say that the US government and NGOs acted directly in strengthening Brazil's censorship apparatus. First, the US government may have assisted the Brazilian TSE in developing strategies to quote-unquote combat disinformation and strengthen censorship practice, with FBI agents and US Department of Justice officials participating in TSE council meetings, with the participation as well of the Brazilian intelligence agency, ABIN. These meetings mark the beginning of TSE's authoritarian escalation. The tactics outlined in the recent Censorship Industrial Complex report by this House Committee on the Judiciary, which details how the Biden administration coerced big tech companies to censor Americans, closely resemble the modus operandi in Brazil. However, while the Biden administration acted mostly informally, Moraes issued judicial orders throughout Brazil's highest court, threatening fines or complete disconnection from Brazil if big tech challenged them, as happened to Telegram in March 2022. American NGOs, including George Soros' Open Society and the Ford Foundation and the Oak Foundation, funded initiatives that worked closely with Moraes. The Atlantic Council, also funded by Soros, supplied reports and the theoretical foundation crucial to his fake news probe. But perhaps the most frightening influence was a systematic campaign that used all the soft power of American foreign policy as a quote-unquote discreet campaign to defend Brazilian elections, according to a 2023 Financial Times article. This involved covert actions by high-ranking U.S. officials, such as the CIA director, the Secretary of Defense, and Biden's national security advisor, who threatened public officials, military leaders, and Brazilian politicians with sanctions to ensure Moraes was not challenged. It's puzzling why the U.S., historically a promoter of freedom and democracy, would use its top officials to support censorship and aid in the ascent of a president aligned with China, Russia, Hamas, Cuba, Venezuela, drug cartels, and opposed to American interests globally, even undermining the dollar as the world's reserve currency. CIA Director William Burns and other Biden administration key agents continue to meet with officials from the Lula da Silva government and TSE in Brazil, focusing on quote-unquote combating disinformation, which we know now is a code word for censorship of unpleasant speech. Additionally, a Brazilian congressional delegation supportive of Lula da Silva regime, including a congresswoman from the Communist Party, visited Washington, D.C. last week to meet with members of the Democratic Party and OAS representatives. Mr. Chairman, you are well aware of the immense challenges you had to overcome in order for this hearing to happen. Why? In Brazil, ultimately, it will be up to the Brazilian people to solve their own problems. But it's important that the United States of America once again become a force for freedom and no longer for censorship. The United States Congress has enormous powers in this direction, and I urge you to use them. First, ensure that Moraes Lula regime stops operating in the shadow. As the Bible says in John 8:32, then you'll know the truth, and truth shall set you free. Brazil needs to be the subject of more frequent hearings, and Congress must continue to use its powers to bring light to the facts. Congressmen, visit Brazil. I speak on behalf of the Brazilian congressmen here that you are welcome in our parliament, and your presence will bring greater visibility to what has been happening. Second, exercise oversight power against executive branch policies that harm not only freedoms in Brazil, but also U.S. global interests, pushing my country towards nations hostile to America, such as China. Third, withhold funds and resources, not only those destined for Brazil, but also for international organizations, such as the OAS, that are shirking their roles. The American taxpayer should not finance the oppression of my people. Finally, produce legislation imposing harsh sanctions on Brazilian government and officials who violate fundamental rights and freedoms. With this help, I guarantee that my country's institution will react and return our freedoms. This is what I beg of you on behalf of millions of Brazilians. God bless America, God bless Brazil.
Iowa, thank you very much for your testimony and for your recommendations. I'd like to now recognize Fabio.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, members of this subcommittee, thank you for this invitation and the honor to testify before you. Thoughts and prayers to the southern Brazilians who are going through a massive flood there. You all have my solidarity. On January 8, 2023, thousands invaded and vandalized the headquarters of 3 government branches in Brazil. This didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the result of a long process by which politicians, media influencers, and others, relying heavily on social media platforms, worked to discredit Brazilian institutions and spread 2 big lies. One, that the Brazilian elections had been defrauded and Lula da Silva, inaugurated a few days before, was illegitimate. Another, that given tensions in society and between government branches, the military had constitutional authority to take over. This was not the first violent action of Brazilian political factions unwilling to accept the results of the 2022 elections. In December, a few weeks after the votes had been counted and Lula was declared president, riots took place in the country, which included an attempt to bomb the Brasilia airport on Christmas Eve. The Supreme Court has been a special target of these extremists since 2020, when it ruled that the COVID policies that former President Bolsonaro planned to adopt were unconstitutional. "I've had enough," shouted Bolsonaro. He actually shouted, "Acabou, porra," which in respect to the subcommittee, I'm not going to translate. Thereafter, Bolsonaro stood up against judges and even said in rallies that he was no longer going to respect court decisions. Others joined this call to confront justices on the streets and on social media. One of their mantras has been that the people are supreme. And in my written testimony, I provide with some pictures of demonstrations where this slogan features prominently. In this vision, courts must bow to what the people want. This is anything but a rule of law system, Mr. Chairman. It's actually a textbook definition of rule of man. As for the judiciary, it had to defend itself almost on its own. The chief federal prosecutor, appointed by Bolsonaro and with the authority to investigate high officials, was refusing to do his job, as demonstrated in studies. Congress, under new leadership, was becoming ever more complacent with Brazil's authoritarian leader. One of the few resources available to justice was to initiate investigations themselves, which in 2019, interpreting Article 43 of the court's bylaw, they understood they had the power to do. Some of these investigations are still underway, and they have produced substantial evidence that there was a plan to stage a coup, including through depositions by the former Bolsonaro's aide-de-camp, Mauro Cid, and the former Air Force commander, Carlos Batista Jr. The issues discussed in this hearing stem from this painful and complex context. Some question the decisions made by the Brazilian judiciary in those investigations, as well as in its capacity to oversee elections. They do so based on conceptions of freedom of speech that misrepresent Brazilian law and private files released by different sources. In my written testimony, I provide this subcommittee with a more detailed explanation of Brazilian law and why I see claims that Brazilians are living under a censorship regime controlled by a single Supreme Court justice, Mr. Alexandre de Moraes, as nonsense. I demonstrate, for instance, that Brazilian law fully allows judges to order the removal of social media posts and the suspension of accounts when those violate others' individual rights or the public interests. I also highlight that the authority of the Supreme Court to initiate investigations of online crimes against itself and against its members was recognized even by Bolsonaro's Solicitor General, Mr. André Mendonça, who currently sits on the court appointed by Bolsonaro. But in these initial and oral remarks, I want to make sure that we don't get lost among the trees and miss the forest. Is there a crisis in Brazilian democracy and rule of law? If there is, it's not because judges are trying to do their job, imperfect as they might be, as all other human beings. It's because we got very close to a point where judges would have become insignificant, subjugated by mobs unwilling to play by the rules of the game. And this, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, is how democracy dies. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask a few opening questions, and then I might do some follow-up after my colleagues have asked their questions. Again, Mr. Schellenberger, you make a very, very cogent case for how you actually thought Lula was a believer in free speech, and then you have now been disabused by that belief on the record, by the record, including against yourself. You point out that the law governing free speech is very robust, but it's not being followed. My colleague, Ms. Wild, mentioned that they have a different law. Well, how much different is it really from the universally recognized right to freedom of expression articulated by the UN and, of course, enshrined in our U.S. Bill of Rights? I am very concerned that we say they have a different definition becomes an excuse for allowing violations of fundamental free speech. In your backgrounder, and as well as in your testimony, you point out the sweeping, Mr. Fabio, sweeping restrictions on freedom of speech as severe as the ones that have been placed in Cuba since the early 1960s. And just for the record, I have raised human rights issues vis-a-vis Cuba my entire 44 years as a member of Congress. And I have had people push back and tell me how that's not true. I have tried to go to Cuba for about 30 years. I've been denied when Fidel Castro was still the dictator. I wanted to visit with the political prisoners. I had hearings on it here in this room and was told, you cannot come in. Even now, I've tried to go to Cuba, which is the paradise of human rights recognition, according to some. I remember we had one clergyman at one of my hearings tell me that his favorite scripture is Matthew 25, where our Lord said, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? So I had a long list of political prisoners, Oscar Bichette, many others, an Afro-Cuban who is an amazing, amazing leader that I had tried to visit with and was told there's no way you're even going to get into Cuba. So I asked this Reverend Walker, who sat right where you're sitting, Michael, you say you visit all these prisoners. Name one political prisoner. He couldn't name a single one because he had not. He was shilling for the Cuban dictatorship, as do so many other people in this town. And to me, that is an outrage, especially since you named the human rights abuse, including human trafficking, child sex trafficking, and all the others. And I wrote the laws on combating human trafficking in this country, as well as around the world. And the idea that we don't speak out against a friend because they are a friend on human rights. I was happy when George W. Bush put Israel and South Korea on the target list for bad actors on human trafficking. Because again, friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. But getting back to, Michael, your comments, could you elaborate, if you will, on this pivot towards crushing free speech of people with whom the Lula government and the Supreme Court justice disagrees?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, so I had an opportunity to interview the current president of Brazil in 1994. I asked him directly if he intended in his version of socialism for Brazil to engage in the kind of censorship and totalitarianism that we see in Cuba. And he was very adamant that he was not going to do that. And my interview with him, by the way, was not the only time that he had said that he would not pursue that level of censorship. Contrast that to his behavior since taking office. Last year, shortly after taking office, Lula created two agencies, the National Prosecutor's Office for the Defense of Democracy, under the supervision of the Attorney General, and it had this Orwellian-named Department for the Promotion of Freedom of Expression with extraordinary censorship powers. I would also note that in all 50 instances where this Office for the Defense of Democracy demanded censorship in the first two-thirds of 2023, according to Revista Oeste last December, and it's a quote, all related to unfavorable information or criticism of the government, the members of the government who had called former President Dilma Rousseff's impeachment a coup, for example, never underwent any investigation. So the idea that there is somehow some effort to neutrally apply anti-misinformation or anti-disinformation laws is disabused by this particular case. We see so many of the things that they're doing, fake fact-checking websites that create predicates for censorship. We see in October 2022, before the second round of presidential elections, Lula's lawyer created a report claiming that supporters of Lula's opponent had created disinformation ecosystem, leading the TSC to indict and censor 55 prominent individuals. That we also know that they created something called the Núcleo de Inteligencia, a secret police force within the TSC to engage in creating predicates for censorship. So this is beyond anything that I had seen around the world, and we saw some very scary stuff in the United States. This is an extreme form of censorship that is, in my view, approaching what they do in Cuba.
Paulo, if I could ask you, has anyone raised complaints with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights or the rapporteur on freedom of expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights?
Yes, hundreds. I'd say 100 people. There are at least one here. I did at least two, actually 3 people here that did file complaints. I did one myself. I'm filing a new one next week. My attorney is also here present. And unfortunately, they have been sitting on these cases, and it's a very sad thing to say. Their latest report says nothing about the violations that are ongoing in Brazil. I mean, you could approach it through different ways, saying that some of these violations are not consensual. I think that's a proper way to describe it. But you need to mention it. They forgot to mention everything. And the problem is that they're mostly funded by U.S. So the U.S. is funding an institution that it's clearly not doing its job, and it's not the first time. They haven't been doing their job in a long, long time, or doing a poor job like they did in Peru, or I can stay here and talk about other countries as well. But the OAS is, and many of the people that are on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights are connected to the Brazilian Supreme Court justice. At least one key figure is connected to Gilmar Mendes, which is another important figure from the Brazilian Supreme Court that supports most of Moraes' actions. So it's a sad thing.
Let me ask you with regards to a study by the Committee to Protect Journalists, an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for press freedom worldwide, as we all know. Brazil ranks 10th in the list of countries where murderers of journalists are most likely to escape punishment. It came out in a report just recently released, February 29th. Matter of fact, the headline was Haiti joins list of countries where killers of journalists most likely to go unpunished. Can any of you share any light on that very, very disturbing acknowledgement by the committee?
I think you have a thing or two to say about that as well, right? It's on your report.
Can I?
Yeah.
So one piece of information that I bring in my testimony is the fact that Reporters Without Borders has recently released their latest ranking on the global press freedom, where Brazil moved up 20 positions from 2022 to 2023. That is to say, after Bolsonaro left
But
power.
from what to what? What are they now?
Say again?
What's their current number?
Current number is, I think, 62. I can check.
Oh, and
84. 62 is the US, but they are in the same tier.
right, and if I can, Mr. Chairman, add that this organization is also funded by George Soros, also funded by the Oak Foundation and the Ford Foundation.
And the Committee to
it's a
Protect
circle.
Journalists-
It's a circle. They support their own narrative, and they fund their own narrative.
And the Committee to Protect Journalists is independent.
It
And
is.
they have now ranked them as number 10.
It's hard to say who funds who, right? But it's
Number 10 isn't very good, believe me. I do have other questions, which I'll come back to, but I yield to Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to note and object to the anti-Semitic trope against Mr. Soros that was just uttered. But moving on, let me turn to you, Mr. De Silva. No, I know I got that wrong.
Figueiredo and Decisive are going to be hard for that.
Yeah,
Silva's easier.
I should have spent last night studying the pronunciations rather than my.
Well,
my
it's
notes.
Fee, Gay, and I know you're a very big LGBT supporter, Sophie Gay Redo.
I am, in fact,
I know.
a big supporter
I
of
know.
LGBTQ
Yes.
rights. Thank you very much for noting that. So, Mr. Disa E. Silva, thank you. I want to talk about the attempts to overturn the 2022 election. In depositions to the Brazilian Federal Police, the former commanders of the Brazilian Army and Air Force asserted that then-President Bolsonaro sought but failed to gain their support for a draft decree to overturn his 2022 election defeat. And that draft decree would have proclaimed the election illegitimate, declared a state of siege, deployed the armed services to ensure the quote, necessary restoration of the democratic rule of law in Brazil. In your assessment, how high was the risk of the coup succeeding had then President Bolsonaro managed to gain the support of these branches of the armed forces?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It was very high. I believe when you draft a decree outlining what's going to happen once the military take over, which in some versions of this drafting even included the arrest of Justice Moraes, I think you're trying to anticipate what you're going to do when push comes to shove. And I want to say that a draft of this decree had been encountered with the former justice minister in the Bolsonaro cabinet, and another draft had been encountered in Bolsonaro's office itself, in his party, when the police conducted a search and seizure there. So it has corroborated by these testimonies the fact that they have been discussing these drafts.
And how long a period was that the draft decree was under drafting?
I'll have to check, but I think it's between the end of the first round of the elections until January.
Okay, and the election, am I right, was in October?
October, yeah,
Okay.
first round.
And so the draft decree wasn't fully prepared until January?
It was in the making.
Okay, and you heard the chairman's comments in response.
You asked me about the risk.
Wait, let me get to,
Okay.
let me just finish what I was going to say. You heard the chairman's comments in response to my opening remarks that Democrats were in the majority, Democrats here in Congress, and we could have done a hearing at that time. However, by the time this decree actually came about in January, as you said, I believe it's a matter of record that Republicans were actually in control on in January of 2023. So by the time we knew of this decree, Republicans were in control. I mean, that's not a question, it's just a statement, sir. Go ahead with what you were just going to respond to, with how high was the risk of the coup succeeding?
Yes, and even the fact that a couple of military officers backed off, to me, it's not an indication that there wasn't support from the military for this to happen. I mean, they were involved in conversations, they attended meetings, I think it was a last-minute decision, making some calculations that this wasn't going to work. And one of the reasons why I think they thought that this wasn't going to work is because there wasn't international support for this kind of solution, especially from the United States government. And so I think you played an important role in securing democracy in Brazil by sending those signals.
But assuming that the armed services or the armed forces had not rejected his attempts, do you believe that the coup would have succeeded?
The circuit would have been closed, right? All the pieces that were needed would have been put together.
Okay. And what do you see? You made. Thank you for the kind remarks about the United States' role, but can you tell us what some of the primary factors were that ultimately prevented a democratic rupture from taking place?
I believe lack of international support, the fact that Lula da Silva is a politician that has high electoral density, so had lots of votes in the country and has great support from the majority of the Brazilian people. Had been somebody weaker, had somebody weaker than Lula been in that position, I think that person could have been run over.
Thank you. And what do you see today as the greatest threat to Brazil's democracy?
primarily the persistence of this thinking that the military has a role to play in civilian government, which is one of the components of this whole plot. I mean, the idea was to create chaos and enable an intervention of the military in civilian politics based on this interpretation, very sketchy interpretation of Article 142 of our Constitution. But that, is something that continues to gravitate in Brazilian media sectors and political sectors. The Supreme Court has just rejected unanimously, by the way, this interpretation of Article 142, including with votes from those justices that were appointed by Bolsonaro. But this was a very key aspect of this process, and it speaks to the history of the country, which had a military dictatorship from 64 to 85.
Well, actually, thank you for bringing that up. Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but let me just ask you, did President Bolsonaro ever refer to military generals as my generals?
Yes, yes, and there was even this video from a ministerial meeting that was also apprehended in this investigation that you make a reference to, where he refers to the fact that the Superior Electoral Court invited the military to oversee the electoral process. And he says, they made a mistake here because I am the commander, the chief supreme commander of the military, as if they were in his hands.
Madam Ranking Member, can I add something to that?
No, I'll get to you in a little bit. I want to just, actually, I have numerous other areas of questioning, Mr. Chairman, but I'd like to give other people an opportunity to ask some questions, and I'll come back.
Chair recognizes the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation. And to the witnesses, thank you for being here and enduring with us. Unfortunately, while I was doing my research, I just came to the conclusion that now Brazil not only has a convicted felon for political corruption as president, Ignacio Lula da Silva, but now has a totalitarian operator as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court called Alexandre de Moraes. Wow. Thank you. I mean, there's nothing to celebrate. Poor Brazilians, they deserve a lot better. The most important country,
saying it, finally.
The most important country in the, economically speaking, or the largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, South America, I should say, to be more precise, deserves better. So, having said this, Elon Musk, the owner of Twitter, has become a target to the highest court because he shoots back. And that's the way you do it in a democracy. Really, we do not know if the Supreme Justice, Mr. de Moraes, is a socialist, or he's a useful fool, or he's a useful idiot for the socialists. But we do know that he is curtailing the most fundamental right that any democracy, including the Brazilians, have, which is free speech. And I really do not understand why. So that's why. Thank you very much, Mr. Schellenberger, for being here with us. And I do want you to explain to us, why do you think that Elon Musk and Twitter is in the crosshairs of this gentleman?
I think the short answer is that X and Mr. Musk just grew fed up with all the illegitimate, unconstitutional, and illegal requests for censorship. It's such a radical demand. In one case, we know that G. Moraes was demanding that X deplatform a sitting member of Congress for content that he had posted on different social media platforms. This is completely absurd and outrageous. All of the claims, all of the major claims that the Brazilian government has made against Musk and including against me are disinformation themselves, including the idea that somehow this is a money play by Musk. The first thing that he said was, we're probably going to lose all of our financial business there and we may go bankrupt. Well, a few days later, the Brazilian government halted all advertising on X. In fact, when I was in Brazil, I was still seeing Brazilian
So for what you're
government
telling
ads.
me, I understand that then the president of the country and the chief justice are in cahoots. Is that what you're telling me?
That's what it appears to be the case.
Do we have any proof of that?
Well, we do know that, yes, we saw media reports while this controversy was going on that G. Moraes had been meeting with Lula and his advisors and coordinating some sort of a response.
But de Moraes was there before Lula was elected once again.
Yes.
So do you know if they had a previous relationship as friends in previous governments? I mean, what it's known about his motives? Who does he work for?
Well, the latter question is a very interesting question. But we definitely know that they reconciled their relationship once Lula was elected president and came to power.
Reconciled, why? They had some arguments before.
Disagreement, yes. And that reconciled and and then we saw in response to Elon Musk's standing up for free speech in Brazil, we saw Jim Moraes go to Lula and spend time with Lula and his advisors, making the case that they needed to continue to fight for more censorship.
And why do you think that Twitter in particular has caused such an irritation?
I just think it's because Musk has got enough resources to be able to stand up to the Brazilian government. It's not easy and I don't think other platform CEOs, besides Rumble and X, have shown the courage. I mean, I think we're not naming the names here, but Google, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, these platforms are allowing the censorship to continue.
And I commend Elon Musk for doing that. Very good. That's exactly what he needs to do, not only in Brazil, but he needs to create the Brazilian model as an example that someone that has... He needs to create an example, not only for Brazil, but for the United States and for the rest of the hemisphere, that you do not mess with free speech. Across the board, it does not matter what you're saying, you have the right to say it as long as it does not bring violence, period. So there are two facts here that I think could shed some light on who Mr. de Moraes is, and these are facts. Number one, he gave the order to take down a post that said that Lula da Silva supports Daniel Ortega, the dictator of Nicaragua. Well, yes, it's true. So why can the Brazilians not know that? So Mr. de Moraes ordered to bring it down. Number two, he gave 1 hour to the company, to Twitter, to take down posts by conservative politicians, or they would be fined $30,000. So 1 hour, what about if you read the email 30 minutes into it? So you only had 30 minutes to take it down, or be fined $30,000. And those two politicians are here, Carla Zambelli and Marcel Van Hatten. Is that true?
Yes.
If I can step in here, we at Rumble have also received these requests, multiple, 9 in total. Our decision was to immediately leave Brazil upon these requests and no longer do business in Brazil based on protecting human rights of free speech. These requests—
That's exactly what they want you to do, leave, which is what Musk is not doing, staying.
I would say that actually the best move is for all of us is to protest and turn off the platforms and not comply with their orders. Rumble did not comply with Moraes' orders. And at this point right now, the other platforms are still in compliance with the orders. Those accounts are banned on those other platforms. On Rumble, we did not ban those accounts. We left the country under the principle of free expression and protecting the human right of free expression. So I believe the best course of action is to all in protest shut off in Brazil and let the entire nation know that this is unacceptable, so that everyone in that country can then protest in their government to push back against this type of behavior.
But does the average Brazilian have any type of recourse to fight this back? I would say they don't, because they're working. And they're
do
busy, and they're trying to make a living. So so my next question is, what can we do from this platform, to all of you, what can we do from this platform to protect the average Brazilian to read on Twitter, on any social media platform, whatever they want to, which is their right? What can we do as members of Congress? Either one.
Well, at the end of my remarks, I offer 4 suggestions. The first one is keep doing what you guys are doing here and then on Committee on the Judiciary, which is shed light to the issues in Brazil. I can say here what people can't in Brazil, and that's why they target me so hardly. The second thing, and you're all welcome, I mean it, to visit Brazil. The mere fact that you go to Brazil and you talk in our house, and I speak on behalf of the Brazilian members of Congress, that we will hold hearings with you if you come to our country, and that itself will shed light. Light is important. I quoted the Bible verse, John 8:32, that you shall know the truth, and truth shall set you free.
Right.
The second is that you have immense power in oversight the executive branch. And the Biden administration has been a force for censorship. They enabled Moraes, and they have been enabling Moraes since the beginning. Not only them, but deep state agents as well, have FBI agents meeting TSC technicians.
But has the Biden administration picked up the phone and reached out to the Chief Justice and explained their disgust for what is happening?
I think they support what's happening. They
support what's happened.
They did. They actually sent the CIA director. They sent Jake Sullivan as well. They sent the Pentagon chiefs to Brazil in order to threaten Brazilian public officials, military leaders, to not challenge Moraes. That's what he's referring when he says, "Well, a coup didn't happen." It's not, no one ever thought of a coup. It's a complete lie. A coup was
Biden administration is interfering.
They openly interfere. There's a piece
foreign-
of the Financial Times, 2023 piece of the Financial Times, called the discreet campaign of the United States to defend Brazil's election. Defend Brazil's election meant that we couldn't challenge the serious concerns that we have about our electoral system. I mean, 82% of Brazilians, of the President Bolsonaro's voters, don't believe in the system. What, they should all be silenced? I should ask him. Because 82% of the election of Bolsonaro, 37% of the country should be silenced because they have concerns about a public service, because the Supreme Court decided that we cannot criticize an electoral system.
United
These
States
are public
has no
officials.
business in interfering in elections in any other country.
Well,
we have
they're doing
enough
it in
problems
Brazil.
with ours.
They've done in Brazil.
Thank you very much for that information, and I'm sure that Chairman Smith, we will take some action. Thank you for your info. Thanks to you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kamalager Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am so glad to join this hearing as the co-chair of the Brazilian caucus. You know, strengthening democracy should be a top priority of the U.S.-Brazil relationship, which is very long, especially given our country's shared experience with horrific attacks on our democratic institutions that were stoked by defeated, thin-skinned presidents seeking to reject the peaceful transition of power. In the United States, insurrectionists stormed this very Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 elections by force, killing people, including members of law enforcement. 2 years later, Jair Bolsonaro and his far-right supporters took inspiration from Trump's election denial playbook and sought to orchestrate a military takeover, busing in protesters to storm all 3 branches of Brazil's government on January 8th. These attacks and the disinformation and conspiracy theories that enabled them represent the very real threats to democracy that we should be discussing. I did visit Brazil. I just came back from Brazil. I was actually there when videotape was revealed and shared of then President Bolsonaro hiding out in the Hungarian embassy. So I just returned, my time. I just returned from leading a delegation of Congressional Black Caucus members to Brazil to learn about our shared histories of racial discrimination. And if we want to talk about strengthening democracy, we should be talking about how we can increase the political participation and economic and social inclusion of Afro-Brazilians who have been murdered and marginalized throughout Brazil's history. And let's shine a light on the historic land grabs and religious persecutions that these communities have continued to face. So instead, this hearing is about protecting Brazil's democracy, but really, it's actually an attempt to undermine it by interfering in Brazil's judicial process and giving a platform to the very individuals who spread lies about Brazil's election. Not only that, the far right in the United States is using the debate around Brazil's fight against disinformation as an opportunity to cry victim when they face accountability for their own anti-democratic actions and to give themselves cover for their enabling of the January 6th insurrection. So if that is not the definition of gaslighting, I don't know what is. I just have a few questions. They're yes or no questions. Mr. Figueiredo, did I pronounce it correctly? All right, apologies. Yes or no? Is it true that you are currently under investigation by the Brazilian Federal Police for your role in the January 8th coup attempt?
I don't know. I haven't received the
That,
proper
thank you,
notice.
moving on, reclaiming. Is it true that an official report from the federal police provides evidence of your participation in a group created to, quote, discredit the electoral process, plan the execution of a coup d'etat, and abolish the democratic rule of law?
Same answer.
You don't know, okay. Do you disavow the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1979 to 1985?
This has nothing to do with what we're
Okay,
discussing
yes
here.
or no, please?
This has nothing to do with
This,
what
yes
we're
or no?
discussing.
Reclaim, I can ask, this is my hearing.
And I can
Yes
answer-
or no?
With
Yeah,
all due
First
respect,
Amendment
I would
rights,
hope
I can
that there
answer
would be respect
whatever I
shown
want.
to the witness, too.
Moving on.
With all due respect for the witness and vice versa.
Mr. Chair, vice versa. Mr. Schellenberger, yes or no? Is it true that you have repeatedly published false information that defamed public figures who are dedicated to combating disinformation?
No.
Including, okay, thank you for that response. Mr. De Silva, I have some remaining questions for you. Can you talk about information that was coming out regarding the January 8th attempted coup and what can be done to make sure that accurate information is shared for Brazilians and for the global community? I think respecting, protecting, strengthening democracy is incredibly important. And I do also agree that we have a real problem with the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation.
Thanks, Congresswoman. I think, is it a yes or no
It
question,
is not a
ma'am?
yes or no question.
Order, please.
Can you repeat the question, Congresswoman?
Yes. To what extent, if at all, did the events of January 8th pose a threat to Brazil's democracy and constitute an attempted coup d'etat? And what are the implications of the attempts to manipulate and deny the nature of the January 8th attack?
I believe we still need to wait for a few months until the investigations are finalized. But recently, as I noted in response to Congresswoman Wild, there has been substantial evidence that there was a plot to stage a coup, that this plot started with the discrediting of the electoral process to seed, among the people, the idea that the elections were going to be defrauded beforehand. And then after the elections took place, there was the idea was to create chaos so that the military could take over based on that sketchy interpretation of Article 142 of the Constitution. So that's the plot that emerges from those documents. I think when it comes to cross-national discussions of domestic political issues, there's always a gap of information that needs to be filled. So a lot of what's happening in Brazil doesn't seem to come across clearly to U.S. authorities as well as the general public. So, for instance, I guess the premise of this conversation has been that Mr. Moraes has taken down social media posts and profiles from the Brazilian right. When I actually demonstrate on page 5 of my testimony that, first of all, it's not just Justice Moraes, right? It's 2 courts involved in this with many justices. And second, that many of these posts and profiles taken down also are from people from the left. And last week, actually, President Lula was fined for a speech that he gave back in the campaign by the TSE, the Electoral Superior Court, which is presided over by Mr. Moraes. So how can one say that there is a collusion between Mr. Moraes and President Lula when the court that Mr. Moraes presides has just fined President Lula for a speech that he gave back in the elections, right? But all these details, it's difficult to convey them because they relate to so specific things. And the same is true for law, right? I believe that I'm the only person in this room that has a Brazilian law degree.
You're not.
And yet, there's a lot of people who want to, interrogate aspects of our criminal procedure in a hearing in the U.S. Congress. I mean, with what information, right? And honestly, with what authority? I think, I believe it's important to have cross-country conversations about domestic political issues, but these need to be more well-informed sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, we don't have times.
We don't use them in
Okay.
this subcommittee.
I have one more question. What is your assessment of the ways in which, and this is for Mr. De Silva, what is your assessment of the ways in which Brazil's judicial institutions and Congress responded to the events of January 8th?
Initially, in the very aftermath of the event, there was great union in the country, not only among the 3 government branches, but even among governors. I believe I was reading, a lot of times it was mentioned here, articles by Jack Nickas from the New York Times. He has written critically about the Brazilian Supreme Court, but he also wrote an article praising Brazil for the way it responded to the January 8 attacks, where there was great union in the country as opposed to the United States. There were investigative proceedings that took place in Congress about this, which produced a very important report that I think needs to go on record. And the Brazilian judiciary is responding through these investigations that we've been mentioning, as well as directly because about 1,000 people were arrested in the buildings, and they are being tried right now as we speak. Some of them are being convicted, for different penalties according to their involvement in the events. I guess about half of them have been given plea deals by which they are not going to even be prosecuted, which to me indicates that the court is trying to sort out who needs to be held really accountable for engaging in violent acts and who had a more ancillary role. So, I think the institutions are responding as they are supposed to do. I mean, this is not an easy situation for any country to navigate, right? And the Brazilian democracy is very young. It's only about, 35 years old. People talk here about censorship and censoring speech of journalists. This is what happened to journalists in the military regime in Brazil. Mr. Herzog was suicided in prisons for trying to critique the regime. There's nothing that's vaguely similar to what happened back then happening right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would just add, I was also there when the arrests were made for the alleged assassination of the Councilwoman Marielle DeFranco. And so as we talk about people being able to speak up and speak out and not be afraid for their lives, I just want to bring her back into this fold. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you all, guys, for your testimony today. I am the Ranking Member on the subcommittee that oversees the Western Hemisphere and the United States relationship with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. And also, as somebody of Mexican descent, very concerned about democracy in the Western Hemisphere. And I think the truth is that over the years, leaders on both the left and the right have abused their people at times. And have abused their countries at times. Unfortunately, I think over the years, the United States' inclination was to call people on the left dictators and leaders on the right allies when that happened. We need to apply the same standards to everyone, whether they're on the left or the right, and make sure they don't abuse their people, that they respect democracy, and that that the people get to determine who their leaders are. That should be our only interest. Our interest is not in picking who Brazil elects as their leaders. That's the choice for the Brazilian people. And so, to the extent that y'all have relayed serious concerns about what's going on in Brazil, then we should look at those and we should have conversations with the Brazilians. I think that is fair. But I also want to be clear that these issues didn't start on January 8th of 2023. There were some very deep issues with President Bolsonaro, and I'm sure with presidents, perhaps on both sides before that. And so I wanted to ask you, Mr. de Sá Silva, I'm sorry, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but what are some of the issues? Because we need some context here, right? The world didn't start in Brazil 2 years ago. So what was going on before that with President Bolsonaro?
You mean before President Bolsonaro?
Well, during that term, well, here, give us, we have a few minutes. I promise I won't go too long, but look.
Oh, I actually teach in it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you said that democracy is only 35 years old. Kind of the evolution of that and how we get here. Look, y'all know that in Latin America, there were disappearances in different parts of Latin America. There are families that still don't know what happened to their kids, right? So getting democracy in Latin America right is very important. Respect for human rights is very important. So how do we get to where we are in Brazil?
Thank you, Congressman. I actually teach an entire course about Brazil from 1988 to 2018 to my students, and it's very interesting because the first 2/3 of the course, I guide them through a process that was very positive for the country of consolidating democratic institutions, democratic practices, and harvesting the fruits that come from this process. In 1988, we had our Constitution. Next year, we had our first election. We had President Collor, who served for a few years. He had was impeached. There was maybe a hiccup in the process. But after that, Itamar Franco took over as rose as the president. Brazil adopted the Real Plan, which stabilized currency. That was very important. It had a very important effect in reducing poverty and in giving people predictability. Cardoso had 2 terms, and then Lula was elected. It was a beautiful scene to see Cardoso passing the sash to Lula, right? A university professor from São Paulo passing a sash onto a metal worker. This shows that rotation occurs in power. And then we had President Dilma Rousseff. She made some mistakes, especially in economic policy, right? But then, after 2013, 2014, the country has been through a turmoil, which deepened or really caused political polarization. And I believe at this point, the Brazilian history converges somehow with the history of the US and many of the democracies that are under stress right now, because we have all these factors: polarization, extremism, the role of social media in help to spread misinformation, right? And really producing a political culture that's antagonistic to democracy and to the rule of law. I hope that gives you some sense.
And I wanted to ask y'all, we had in our own country January 6th of 2021, which has been described as an insurrection. I think that it was a kind of attempted coup. In Brazil, you had January 8th, 2023. Where is Brazil in holding people accountable, the people that were directly involved in that attack?
There are several key differences. The first one is that you can claim that January 6th was an insurrection. You can claim that, but because President Trump was in power. But in Brazil, Lula was the president already, had been for 8 days on January 8th. So I don't think we had an insurrection, because what would be the outcome of the insurrection? Let's say on January 6th.
But we've seen in Latin America and around the world, leaders can get overthrown by insurrections and coups.
But Lula wasn't even there. No one was there. It was a Sunday. So it was definitely a riot that went out of control.
But if you overtake the building and you don't let government operate
I
and
agree
so
with
forth.
You. I was the first one. I was working on the largest TV network at the moment. I asked to join in and get on air, and I was the first one on air saying these people were stupid from doing what they were doing and they should go back home.
So you think they should be held accountable?
I think they should be held accountable by the crimes they committed individually, meaning if they desecrated public patrimony, yes, definitely. Let's hold them accountable. But they were not attempting a coup d'etat. There was no way, that was not possible. You cannot commit, there's a law professor here, you cannot commit a crime if the crime is impossible. Right. That's a principle in the law.
Yeah, okay, so we disagree on that, but I get it. But let me ask one more question, because y'all have had a long hearing as subcommittees go, all right? On the question of Rumble, the Brazilian government, in September 2021, then President Bolsonaro attempted to ban social media companies from removing certain content. And under that policy, social media companies would not be able to remove any content unless it pertained to nudity, drugs, and violence, or if they encourage specific crimes. And so here you've been making the case that the current Brazilian government shouldn't call Rumble and say, hey, take down this specific post or so forth, right? Well, but the reverse of that is, do you believe that a government should be able to make such rules, or do you believe that a private company, private entity like a social media company, should be able to remove content from their platform? In other words, if you go back under Bolsonaro, was President Bolsonaro right to tell social media companies, hey, you can't take anything down except XYZ?
With respect to Rumble, Brazil has no jurisdiction on anything on Rumble whatsoever. We do not have employees there. We do not operate there. We're a U.S. company with offices in Canada as well. Brazil has zero jurisdiction to make any sort of claim to remove anybody off of our platform.
So your position is that Bolsonaro was wrong and Lula's wrong?
My position is that if we don't operate in that nation, they have no jurisdiction whatsoever to ask us to remove anything from our platform. Rumble operates under the laws of the United States, which is the First Amendment, and we believe, and we all believe in this room, that freedom of expression is a human right, which is also Article 19 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So when someone asks to remove a political creator or a non-political creator that doesn't violate the terms of service of any platform, I'm fully opposed to that.
Well, no, and I just want us to be consistent, right? Because the point that I've made is that under the left and the right, you've had presidents who get heavy-handed, right? And like I said, we should take a look and talk to the Brazilians if they are infringing on different free speech issues. But this has happened repeatedly in different ways with people in different parts of the political spectrum. And we have to be mindful of that as well. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castro, for those comments, because I do believe that this is a pivot point, and I think we need to be making a very clear a statement to Lula and to the Supreme Court that it is intolerable to violate freedom of expression, freedom of speech. You know, Lula himself compared the Israelis to it's like when Hitler decided to kill the Jews. I abhor that comment that Lula made. Reuters reported it. But it's a free speech. He has an opportunity to say it. You know, I don't agree with it, but he has the right to say it. And I would say equally, people who disagree with the Lula government or with the Supreme Court should have an unfettered ability to speak out without facing potential criminal charges, without being deplatformed. And to that, I would like to just ask Christopher Pavlovsky, what kind of Rumble creators were targeted for orders? You know, who were they focusing on?
So we've received multiple orders from the Brazilian Supreme Court, and they range from various different creators, some political, some journalists, some, I would say, just that talk about anything. The very first order that did come to Rumble to remove, and we had multiple orders on this individual specifically, was a person by the name of Monarch, who, as my understanding, is like the Joe Rogan of Brazil and has no real political affiliation or is, you know, identifies with any political side at all. And that was the first order that we received to remove.
Ms. Wild?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Figueiredo, close enough?
Good job.
I have a few simple questions. Would appreciate simple answers, and I know the chairman would like to get us out of here by noon, so maybe we can expedite this. Can we agree, you and I, that the 1964 to 1985 military government was an anti-democratic regime responsible for killing hundreds of political opponents?
It depends. You can't compare what was happening in 1968, as Professor here can better explain, to what was happening, for example, in 1979. When my grandfather was president, for example, he already got in power with the AI-5, which was a very undemocratic act. It was not in place anymore. First thing that he did was to give amnesty to political prisoners. We had free speech. We had the Supreme Court working. I'm trying to answer your question.
So you disagree that the military government was an anti-democratic regime?
Well, it's a nuanced answer, like I just said. Part of it, yes. Part of it, no.
Okay. Do you agree that they killed hundreds of political opponents?
Some of them, yes, and some of them in the guerrilla as well.
Okay.
But I don't think that's the purpose of what we're talking about here. This is not a hearing about the history of Brazil. It's about what's happening now.
Okay, so let's move on. Do you believe that the 2022 elections, and by the way, history does dictate what a democracy looks like, as I noted in my opening remarks. So history is very, very relevant.
Yeah.
Do you believe, sir, that the 2022 elections were in fact free and fair?
I do not.
Do you believe that the Brazilian armed forces then should have acted to support President Bolsonaro's draft decree?
Who? I'm sorry?
Do you believe that the Brazilian armed forces should have acted to overturn the 2022 election results?
I do not.
Okay, so even though you don't believe them to have been fair and free, you don't believe that the armed forces, you believe they properly acted in not acting to overturn those results?
Madam Congresswoman, are you familiar with the report of the military on the elections of Brazil?
I am, yes, but...
So what do you think they should have done when they realized that Brazilian elections
It's simple. Do you believe that the armed forces acted appropriately?
I do not.
And let me just read a few statements by former President Bolsonaro, and let's just see if we can agree or disagree on this. These are quotes. Elections won't change anything in this country. It will only change on the day that we break out in civil war here and do the job that the military regime did not do, killing 30,000. If some innocent people die, that's fine. In every war, innocent people die. Agree or disagree with that statement?
That statement is from 1994, and I completely disagree with it. And
You're
I think
very
President
familiar with the statement. Yes, he made it as a member of Congress, but then years
Yes.
later as a presidential candidate.
So I
he
disagree.
He refused to disavow that statement. So
Well,
you agree or disagree
I
with that?
completely disagree with that.
Okay. And then he went on to say, I have three alternatives for my future: being arrested, killed, or victory. Do you agree or disagree with that statement at the time that he made it?
Well, I think he has a very high chance of being arrested, but I disagree with his statement as well.
And do you see that as an acknowledgement that he might lose the 2022 election, his statement?
I think he expressed his distrust on the electoral system since the beginning.
In 2018, then presidential candidate Bolsonaro called Colonel Ustra a national hero. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I don't have enough information to answer that question.
Okay. And in office, he reinstated commemorations of the 1964 military coup and openly celebrated the military dictatorship. Agree or disagree with that?
Agree.
Action? Thank you.
It was a counter coup against a communist coup. So, yes, we did not want a communist to be part of Brazil as it was in Cuba and other countries. But I do not agree with the route that several leaders in Brazil took for many, many years. And I come from a family that has been fighting for democracy for a long time. And that's the legacy of my grandfather, restoring full democracy in Brazil. So I'm very supportive of that.
I appreciate your family's efforts at restoring democracy and upholding democracy. And just because you have pointed out earlier on one of my particular interests, I wanted to bring to your attention public remarks that I'm sure you have heard the former president say attacking the LGBTQ community. One example being that he stated he could never love any of his children if they were gay. Do you find such comments harmful to marginalized communities in Brazil and ultimately to a Brazilian democracy?
Well, I don't agree with these remarks, but I'm not here to defend President Bolsonaro. I'm here to defend free speech.
Okay, I'm not asking you to. My question is,
with all due respect,
let me
this
finish
is
my
not
question.
a inquisition of
But it's a hearing
former
about
president.
democracy, and I just want to know whether the witness believes that those kinds of statements are supportive of a democracy.
I don't think they're nice statements,
I
but
don't
I
think
think they're
the witness
protected.
needs to answer that. I think we've veered so far away from the purpose of this. I mean, I could talk about skepticism for elections. In my first election, 2,000 dead people voted against me. It was engineered by the Democrats in the city of Trenton. When I tried to get the officials to look into it, and we verified it had happened, they would not do it. We got the verification that it happened, but there was no effort to hold people to account. Okay, you just move on. There is a healthy skepticism that we should all have. Matter of fact, my opponent went into court to keep the city of Trenton open beyond the time limit because it was raining out, and the fear was some people might not be able to make it to the polls. They were going to count how many people they needed in order to defeat me. Now, I learned from it. I became friends with a lot of people. The county clerk told us, do you ever wonder why you never got the A ballot position? Because they used to refrigerate the ball. He would put his hand in, pull out the A position, and the Democrats would get the A position each and every year. And a similar type of effort was lodged against me with people who were dead voting. That said, I still believe in the system. I still believe that we need to have a healthy skepticism. I have a healthy skepticism. I voted to ensure that Biden was made the president during the Electoral College. Why? Because we could not prove, or the administration could not prove that it had been falsified. But there was all kinds of mistakes made, and I also had to look back at my own experience, but you got to be able to prove it. But that said, you move on. This hearing is not a relitigation of January 6th or January 8th, despite some efforts to cloud over this issue of freedom of expression being violated with impunity. So we're going to keep a focus on that. Lulu does not have a right, nor does the Supreme Court justice in Brazil, to violate people's free speech rights, which are universally recognized. As you pointed out, Mr. Schlesinger, in your statement, the Constitution couldn't be clearer. That's what this is about. So any other thought, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Really is a distraction in a very real way. Again, so I would ask, and I am going to honestly continue pushing very hard to ensure that free speech rights, which are universally recognized, are recognized by Brazil. Hearing's adjourned.
Let the record reflect that the chairman has cut off the ranking member in contravention of our usual tradition of not doing so.
Well, with all respect, we reconvene. Make your final statement.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You have to give me one moment because I closed my binder here. And thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I do want to address what I consider to be the harmful impact of oligarchs on a democracy. And in particular, there's been a great deal of defense in this hearing today of Mr. Musk and his platform. And I think it's very important that we understand his ideological agenda. We're talking about somebody, and I'm referring to Mr. Musk, who not only does not believe in labor unions and who here in the United States has attempted to stop workers at his company from organizing, but he's also challenged the constitutionality of the National Labor Relations Board in court. So that gives you an idea of just how much Mr. Musk values people's rights. And I think that it's important that we understand the impact on democracy of oligarchs like Mr. Musk, who act as if their wealth and their power places them above the law and provides them with some sort of global mandate to destabilize democracies around the world, including Brazil and right here in the United States. He and his allies and our witnesses and the chairman claim not to have an ideological agenda apart from defending freedom of expression, but let's face it, they have a pattern of going after progressive, democratically elected governments which prioritize issues such as workers' rights and national sovereignty over natural resources. So while they frame their actions in the context of freedom of expression, I think that it would be accurate to say that freedom of expression is threatened by the unregulated flow of false information. With that, I yield.
You mean me?
Pardon me?
You're talking about me?
I was talking about the witnesses.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for their testimonies. I hope that the people of Brazil will look at this, and be encouraged that there are people in Congress, not all perhaps, but there are people who strongly believe that they have a right to freedom of speech. That is a hallowed right, it's a God-given right, and it should not be circumscribed for political agendas. So I want to thank you. You know, Elon Musk, whether I'm pro-labor, I'm a pro-labor union guy. That said, you know, if he has a position against labor unions, he's entitled to it. I disagree with him. I have a bill in that's going to pass soon, hopefully on the floor. It passed out of the Ways and Means Committee on cobalt. Cobalt is being extracted from the DR Congo through child labor, and unfortunately, cobalt is a mainstay of the electric vehicles, and unless that supply chain can be cleaned, because it is going into his cars as well, we've got a real problem there, because nobody should drive a car that was built on the backs of dead children in DR Congo, and we're talking about 25 to 40,000 kids, 200,000 adults, all in forced labor. That said, Elon Musk has been a refreshing, and I think a very important voice about freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And I laud him for it. I thank him for it. And I'm so glad that he's taking such a principled stand in Brazil as well as around the world. Hearing is adjourned.
I'm excited to announce we're having a huge MyPillow spring sale, and here's a few examples. Buy one of our MyPillow 2.0s, you get another MyPillow 2.0 absolutely free. Made with cooling technology, the best pillow ever just got even better. And this just in, 9 brand new colors and styles of our Percale bed sheets. They're made with the finest long staple cotton, and now you can save 50% or more. That's as low as $24.98. And for the first time this year, I'm bringing you our My Slippers and Sandals for as low as $25 a pair. So go to MyPillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get your MyPillow 2.0s. Buy one, get one free. Percale sheets as low as $24.98. My Slippers and Sandals as low as $25 a pair. And for a limited time, when you order $75 or more, your entire order ships absolutely free.
Welcome to the Right Side Broadcasting Network. We're not like the other media outlets out there that cut and edit what other people say. In 2015, we were created by our founder, Joe Seals, to cover President Donald J. Trump's speeches and rallies, to which we continue to do to this day. We've also covered important conservative events like CPAC, TPUSA, March for Life, and many other important events and hearings around the country. We were made for people like you, everyday Americans who are tired of the mainstream media, who are tired of being lied to, manipulated, and fed an agenda. Our goal here at Right Side Broadcasting is to allow you to see the truth, giving our correspondents and commentators a wide latitude to speak their minds. You won't find anything like this in the mainstream media. Your support through your donations, locals, and supporting our advertisers allows us to continue to cover important events around the country each and every day. So, from us here at Right Side Broadcasting, thank you for supporting us and the right side of history.